Ne mora sad, samo pitam.
Okay, I guess we can formally start. Yeah, it's okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the conference. I could say also a welcome to myself because, shame on me, I've been not present the first 2 days, unfortunately, due to my other obligations. But I'm sure you had an exciting time and fruitful discussions. And hopefully it will be the same today at our panel. And it's really my great pleasure and honor to introduce the panelists. Louis Bonnet, professor from University of Barcelona, who will present first from Catalonia and from Spain a bit. Pedro Costa from University Institute from Lisbon, from Portugal, and his colleague, who is in the audience but wrote the paper together, Ricardo Venancio Lopez, and our dear colleague from region, Jasmina Husanovic, professor from the University of Tuzla from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my name is Ljiljana Rogaš-Mijatović, for those of you who don't know me. I'm associate professor at the Faculty of Drama Arts here at the University of Arts in Belgrade. So, as usual, 15 minutes per presenter, and I will also say a few words about your presentation, just title, International Cultural Relations from the Perspectives of the Peripheries. And I'm sure that Professor Bonnet will have an exciting presentation because he included also some, it will be a surprise. Okay, please. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be in this third day, and the audience, even though, of course, it's difficult to be in early morning, but in any case, thank you for being here. Okay, so as you know, most of our presentations are connected to the book that will be published this summer, so you will be able to read our papers, but I tried to do something a little bit more alive and more connected to the topics and the spirit of the conference. Of course, for me, it's impossible so I have my colleague, Jose Vicente, that he's a player. So sorry, I'm a very simple and boring university professor, not able to perform like him. So, but in any case, I decided that to use just this way to introduce the topics, which is, okay. So I will use my time in order to just talk about 3 different topics, interconnected topics, and I will finish with final reflections. So I will start just sharing with you some elements of the asymmetries, the existing asymmetries in international cultural relations. I will later introduce a scheme, a conceptual scheme that could help to understand both the drivers on international cultural relations, so the reasons why the different players decided to be active in international cultural relations, and at the same time, the different logics in this center-periphery tension, economic, social, political, cultural logics, who affects them. After this, I will focus myself on policies, governmental policies in this field. And finally, I will finish with these reflections, okay? So, and these are the pictures and the reason why I changed my presentation from the one I sent before and the one I mean. So, if you just walk very close to here, in the main street, the pedestrian street, you will see the Cervantes Institute, the French Institute, and I'm asking myself every time I see this kind of big buildings in the most expensive place of capital cities. So what is the cost benefits of teaching foreign languages in such expensive rooms? What are the reasons? What is the message that the governments are sending both internationally and to the domestic audience? And of course, there is a very important question. I guess it makes sense for them. but it makes sense as well for the taxpayers of their own countries, or only to a few elites that are interested on this kind of policy. So welcome to international cultural policy, Paul. Okay, so asymmetries. In a way, they reproduce the existing inequalities. And these existing inequalities between hegemonic and not hegemonic countries and regions and their cultures. Why and which kind of countries are more active in this kind of international relations? Well, first, large countries with geostrategic and imperial interests and ambitions. We see what are doing the main powers, from the United States, China, Russia, some European countries as well, etc. In other cases, we see that some countries could be very active when they have a very strong and dynamic culture industry, eager to expand their own products. And finally, we can see not either of these two groups of countries, but in some places, there is a genuine interest by the cultural operators on being in this kind of dynamics. Sometimes that happens in countries rich enough that their cultural organizations are sustainable, but at the same time, small countries that they need to have this international relation in order to go a little bit farther from their own domestic space. So these are the three main groups of countries. And the question is, what happens with the peripheries? Peripheral countries, peripheral organizations, peripheral professionals, because we can be in a rich country but be a peripheral professional. So in this case, that depends on change, on the ability to wake up, and the imagination to be present in these international agoras. Well, what are the factors of these asymmetries? I think we have to think always on the domestic political situation, because that could explain, for instance, the level of freedom internally, or if there is a top-down or a bottom-up kind of relationship in the cultural field in relation to the cultural policies, the level of governmental support. So these are one of the factors. Second factor is more social-oriented, so the openness of the society, the mobility inside the society. So it's not the same immigrant society or not, etc. There is, of course, factors connected to the economic situation, the availability of resources, and the business structures of the cultural sector. And finally, more internal cultural needs, so connected to the interests, the abilities of the cultural sector. So, but in any case, is it possible to change our view on the world map? You can see here, the map is not north-south, it's south-north. So it is possible to reverse these inequalities. What strategies can emerge from the peripheries, and how to achieve a more equitable enrichment of human creativity? So these are some of the questions which are in the base of this analysis and what I will try to share with you today. And now I'm going to the scheme, the conceptual scheme I wanted to present today. There are many peripheries. We have been discussing about this all over this project. So there are spatial, geographical kind of peripheries, both at domestic level, at international level. There are cultural recognition peripheries, and there are as well institutional power peripheries. So, and probably there are more. I just wanted to concentrate in these three axes. And when we talk about geographic peripheries, we talk both the rural, the global south, the non-spaces in metropolitan areas, or when we talk about peripheries from the point of view of cultural recognition, we talk about unknown artists, nobody cares about some expressions, minoritarian cultures inside an hegemonic cultural scene. And when we talk about the institutional power peripheries, we talk about the independent sector, the non-formal sector, the self-exploitation of artists and professionals in order to survive in this jungle. And how this connects with these four main logics, which are the drivers, the reasons why we want to be involved in international relations. So from an economic point of view, it's clear that maybe being an international project means better economic sustainability, increased funding, being in a higher competition market with the benefits and the difficulties of that, the risk. Also, the idea that how, in a moment that these huge platforms sharing cultural content, how the connection between cultural diversity and homogenization works, etc., etc. From a political point of view, it's clear that the reasons are connected to the enforce the local or national identity, some kind of proudness of being from one place, the political recognition of institutions and politicians, intergovernmental alliances, geopolitical kind of alliances that you use culture as a way to build this kind of alliances, and sometimes as well the colonial strategies. From a cultural point of view, of course, the reasons are much inherent to this logic. So it's cultural innovation, is exchanging with learning and from others, etc. So now I try to connect, because I see that the time is going on, I try to connect this with policies who tries to support this. I think there are three main objectives. And these three main objectives could explain why in some cases foreign affairs ministries or cultural ministries support this kind of relationship from a different logic. So if the dominant logic is the soft power logic, so culture as an instrument of prestige and influence at the service of political, economical, and geostrategic interests for the national elites, things, of course, will be organized in a way, the orientation will be specific, the typology of programs will be different if the logic, the dominant logic is a commercial logic. I want to support our own cultural industry, to be abroad, to sell products abroad, or to make possible the sustainability of our own artists, because the domestic market is too small for that. There is as well a more genuine cultural logic, which is the idea that exchange, mobility, understanding the other. And we see that in some cases, some of the international cooperation programs tries to support this kind of logic as well. When we analyze this from the point of view of Europe, what we see is a lot of differences. So the Goethe Institute is not following the same logic that the British Institute or the French Institute or the Cervantes or the Dante Alighieri. So they, or the embassies, because the embassies also have, but the issue, and that's for me very important, is to understand that how this is connected to the interests of the different stakeholders, how they push these policies, and what is the relationship between governmental bodies and policies and the different stakeholders affecting. What is the role of network? What is the role of association? What is the role of an active cultural sector? But of course, asymmetries at the European level continue to exist. I just finished a research on the relationship between ASEAN countries, the southeastern countries, and the European Union, and it's very clear, this kind of asymmetries. So we can, I don't have time now to go on this, but I think it's important. In a current moment of revival of soft power, because there is a geostrategic configuration at world level, What is happening? Well, I think all intelligent people in the governmental field and in the political field knows that the loss of the monopoly, the state monopoly on international cultural relations is, I think, is accepted by everyone. But that doesn't mean that when you analyze the programs sometimes and the wishes of the civil servants and the politicians in charge of that at top level, they are not very happy. So in a way, they try to coordinate the different governmental agencies in, I think, a not very successful attempt to align everyone in the country brand. What we see as well is a prioritization of big events or to those very focused on specific elites. So it's both sides of the spectrum. We see that they try to influence all the stakeholders, public and private, that operates at these international relations through financial support. But of course, that not always happens. Of course, some of the logics of asking for grants are pushing us in their own interest, but not always this is a successful kind of result. Also, we see quite a lot of alliances between the giants of the culture industry and the state interest. Sometimes it's difficult to know to whom is the interest. And at the same time, we see that there is a maintenance of, I think, outdated instruments, like the traditional bilateral agreements between country A and country B in the field of culture, or, I don't know, twinning cities, you know, these kind of things, or the year from one country in another country. We see that this is not disappearing, even though I'm wondering about the results, the real impact. What happens when we see this from the point of view of the South? It's clear that invisibility, it's clear that structural inequalities, it's so evident. There is the visa problem, which is horrible in the sense that for us it's very easy to go there, for them it's very difficult to come here. So, and I'm trying now to finish. The key question is how to achieve a more equitable enrichment of human creativity through these international cultural relations. It is possible to reverse the current inequalities. What kind of strategies could emerge from the peripheries? What is our role in order to push in this direction? And peripheries, as I said before, there are many peripheries. I think, and I'm trying now to go to something that we will discuss later in the next roundtable, is I think there is a key question, a deontological question, connected to, do we accept to be part and to legitimate cultural diplomacy at the interest of the elites, the geostrategic positions, and so on? Do we have some margins of freedom in order to use that in another way? So this is, for me, it's very important, because what is very clear is that we see that it's growing colonial approaches, national populism approaches, non-supportive or respectful of diversity and minorities approaches in many of these policies. So how we react to that? And what red lines we need to discuss among us in order to be together reacting to this? Because from an isolated position, it's very difficult to, so it's sometimes there are very brave people, but I don't think this is the solution. The solution is agreements among us in order to see which are the red lines. And I stop here trying to follow my...
Thank you so much, Professor. I had so many things to write down, and I hope that we will have time for discussion as well. But now we move on immediately to our next presenter, Pedro Costa from Portugal. The title of the presentation is Cultural Policies in the South, Implications for Territorial Policies. So the paper is written in co-authorship with Ricardo Venancio Lopez, but Pedro will present, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome to this session. Thank you for your presence. We are talking about policies here, cultural policies, but in a specific angle that is to extract something from this project about territorial policies and territorial-oriented or territorial-based cultural policies. In that sense, what we will be doing here today is, in spite of the kind of letter, is completely different there than here, but is, after the introduction, try to just give a little hint about what these southern peripheries can be at the light of what Luis has just said, for instance, and that we've been discussing much in this project, and then try to extract some outcomes of this project, of this Stronger Peripheries project, about the specificities of cultural activity in these southern territories in which we are, trying then to extract some general principles and very general guidelines in terms of territorial policy making in this field of culture, and some it's a little ambitious to call this recommendation, but some hints regarding the EU support to these kind of participatory cultural projects. So this is the aim of the presentation, is to try to see what we learn from these territorial-based cultural policies or territorial-based public policies for culture from this Stronger Periphery project. And this is particularly important in the contemporary context of cognitive cultural capitalism, because what we are talking about is that we have public policies that many times are not flexible, and they should have the flexibility to adapt to the contexts and particularities of the communities and the territories. And that is in the core of the idea of the cognitive cultural capitalism, because what you have is the symbolic and aesthetic and cultural attributes of the goods, the services, and the territories in the core of the value creation, and so cultural policies should address that. And when I'm talking about cultural value and cultural creation of value, I'm not talking about economic value, and we'll go to that. Not just economic value, also economic value, but value at several dimensions of creation of value: artistic value, social value, environmental value, and so on and so on. So the objectives of the public action, as well as the recognition of these cultural policies and recognition of impacts of cultural policy, are contextual and territorially based. And the southern peripheries, as we are, have a context that brings some common ground to our action, as Luis also was suggesting, that can add and go beyond the particularities and specificities of each territory that we are working on. And in that sense, I will not go in detail. We'll talk a little more about this in the paper, but here it's just to contextualize what are you talking when we're talking about these southern peripheries. We have been recurrently discussing along the project what is this south, what means to be south. We are in this intermediate south between north and south, geographical south, reputational south, institutional and power south, as Luis has just said. So we are in this in-between situation, and it's the same in terms in periphery. We are in this between situation in peripherality. And we feel to be part of this intermediate situation and to be seen as it, as consequences in terms of policies and in terms of our positioning and the positioning of policymakers. And so we have to address also the idea that the identification of each institution or each stakeholder with or artist or policymaker or whatever, or institution with a community or territory is complex and based on a continuous process that is built every day. And so this positioning and this identifying as being part of this territory, of this community, of this south, of this periphery, is important point of view for the policy, and the policy that is making at several scales at the same time. So what we have from our practices in these peripheries, more or less stronger, and the provocation of the title of the project, the stronger peripheries, not provocation, but also desire of have stronger peripheries. It was some kind of reaction to these kind of problems that we have in these peripheries. The low density, and the low density can be seen at several levels. Absence of critical mass, critical thresholds in terms of supply or demand of activity, of service, or of social practices. Lack of skills, competencies, at least skills and competencies that we are supposed to have to do things in a certain way. And lack of attractivity to retain human resources, financial resources, to retain the attention and in the communicational circuits and the communicational mechanisms. So for this is fundamental, the network and the seizing, and this is fundamental, this idea of the Southern Coalition in terms of seize the network effects of this, because we gain scale, we gain density, we gain heterogeneity, we gain variety, so we gain the things that are the drivers for match of the high density and for instance, the centers. But we have also high costs related to peripherality, costs in terms of money, in terms of time, and so on. We can see the example of transportation between our different meetings. And we have often condemned to deal in the minimum common denominator. For instance, we are here all speaking in English. No one of us is English, but we all, and in all the projects, we are trying to work with what is the least worst scenario in several things. And so after that, we also clearly see a deficit of recognition, of reputation in the art worlds for being peripheral, for being from the South, including acknowledging existing skills and potential different skills and certain potential competitive advantages in the modes of doing that we have that are different from the others. This relation with time, the informality, the certain kinds of sociability that are many times addressed as a disadvantage, but they are also a potential, as we can see also, and as we've been discussing here. But in terms of recognition of these, they are, of course, generally not well reputed in the art worlds and the functioning, general functioning, or central functioning in the art worlds. And, of course, related to this, as Luis also said, difficulty in entering in cultural circuits, having visibility in the access to mediation and gatekeeping processes that are centralized in the several art worlds. We have lack of competencies, of skills, but also often, not always, but often, lack of ambition and motivation in the own cultural institutions. And there are some kind of accommodation to things, to paternalism regarding audiences that are not used to several things. A certain unawareness that we see here, even with us, with our partners and with us, that we are policymakers, but we don't see that we are policymakers because we have, the others are the responsible also. And so there is some ambition that probably, and motivation that probably you can go further on that. But of course we have a huge potential in the relation with communities and territories. Communities and territories that have specificities, have particularities, and that particularities are fundamental in the cultural cognitive capitalism again, as we have symbolic and aesthetical differentiation aspects that are important. Including the empowerment of what is a community and what is working with a territory versus the usual ways of looking for the standard ideas about what is a community or what is a territory, for instance. but we lack complementary resources to our action, private or public, and there is the huge difficulty in mobilizing additional funding or support mechanisms, as all we know. In spite of that, we have specificities and opportunities to do things differently regarding artistic creation, regarding artistic production, regarding cultural experiencing. I would also say regarding gatekeeping mechanisms, in spite of this is more difficult. So we have different temporalities, stakeholders with different profiles, multiplicity of cultures that can be seized as opportunities and not as disadvantage. By the same token, we have also different kinds of awareness about the potential for action by the diverse stakeholders in this territory. We tend to put all the responsibilities in the policy and the policy makers, but the governance of the system is not just the responsibility of policies. Policies relate with the functioning of all the systems, with our action as citizens, our action as programmers, as artists, as producers, and the things are interacting. And so cultural policies are part of this ecosystem and not the full responsibility in the ecosystem. All of us are actors also in terms of policy. So what do we extract from here we were talking about contents that we said. I will talk essentially in these guidelines about processes and about what we can cross in terms of general principles of organization of policies. We are talking about territorial-based policymaking, and territorial-based at different scales. And when we talk, that can be national, regional, local, international. When we talk about territorial-based, we talk embed in the territory and the characteristics of the territory, and so differentiated policies and acknowledge the diversity of contexts that can be seen at the level of the southern peripheries or the sub-peripheries of sub-southern peripheries and their specificities. So first thing, it's always the same, but it's not. But it still needs to be remembered: the importance of the assumption of culture, the importance of culture, and the importance of culture when we compare and when we have other fields for public policy. Culture, not necessarily cultural policy, that is a different thing, is central or must be central in cultural policy, in public policies, particularly in this context of cognitive cultural capitalism that we are at the several levels. Second issue, work with territories and with the communities. This is different of work at the territories or in the territories or in the communities, different from work for the territories and for the communities. And so it's fundamental, and that is a learning that, of course, we have here and the practice that we have in the project. Having mutual dialogues, not afraid of instrumentalization. Of course, all of us in cultural field are afraid and used to many processes of instrumentalization by politicians, by economic drivers of society, even by artists also. But we have instrumentalization, particularly all the rhetorics of creativity, creative economics, and so on and so on. But these also have positive aspects, and art and culture, of course, must be seen and is often forgotten. It's certain, but it should not be forgotten. But as an end of development. But at the same time, culture is fundamental to promote the other dimensions of sustainable development. Culture fosters social inclusion, culture forces expresses of identities, culture enhances economic development, tourist attraction, and so on. All of this is also important. But we have to balance the two things, and we have to enter in this dialogue without fear of instrumentalization, but know what our position and address it. Then the focus in transversal articulations. All of you that are involved in policies and in politics are aware of these. The permanent need of intersectoral articulation, culture with education, culture with economics, culture with social, culture with ecology, and so on and so on. Interinstitutional and multi-scale articulation, the local with the regional, the European levels, and so on, and the different institutions at the same level, and different institutions, and different municipalities, different metropolitan areas, and so on and so on. And also the governance in wider terms, public, private, and other forms of governance and regulation mechanisms that we have that are dealing with the artistic systems and economic systems. Then a continuous management of the different interests and conflicts. it's natural that people have that cultural agents, economic agents have different rationalities and different interests, even if theory many times do not acknowledge that. But it's natural, and they are legitimate, most of them at least. And the idea is that the management of these tensions is the fundamental in terms of policies, and the different stakeholders, the way we can manage and the relations of power between these stakeholders. And of course also the tensions in the territories when we have it. For instance, cultural activities have huge externalities, positive externalities for some agents and negative externalities for other agents. For instance, tourism or other kind of, or a performing arts concert in the middle of the city have positive and negative impacts for many people in the city. We tend to oversee the positive aspects regarding the negative, and I think it's also a huge importance in policy. But this management of interest is a key thing in the policy making that we should not forget. We are talking about specificity, about the periphery that we are, the south that we are, and knowledge complexity of these identities that we are addressing, that we are, and the multiplicity of societies that we have at the core of this is fundamental, of course. So value specificity, but acknowledging that the identity is not something solid, quiet, it's something that evolves, and it's something that is permanent construction. So not simplify what is identity and address the complexity of identities, perceive the complexity and the dynamics in identities when we talk about territories and work with specific communities. And here, a discussion that we had recurrently in the project during these years is what is this kind of community? What is what we learn? We think that is a community, what we learn with daily community, what is the community, what is the identity, or what is our representation of a community that is completely different many times. The attention to the symbolic sphere, of course, and territorial reputation. The policies and the cultural policies and other policies are intimately related to the territory and the image of the territory, the reputation, the branding also of the territory. So we have here interaction that it's important to deal, of course, the relation between what we are doing and what we are representing, and what is also the tension between the politicians, for instance, and technicians in the same municipality, for instance, when we are dealing about the two things, or the reputation for the artists, for the agents, and for the electorate is not the same, or can be not the same. And so we have dealing these different kinds of representations and the symbolic sphere and the territorial reputation. Of course, and also all the things addressed to territorial marketing and so on. Finally, the idea of flexibility and avoiding the dangers of institutionalization when we talk about culture, creativity, and we are talking about things that, and creative dynamics, we are talking about things that can be that can be very harmful, the institutionalization of procedures, the institutionalization of practices, and many times they rely on governance mechanisms that are much more based on informality and based on relations that must be enhanced and fostered and understood, and not to institutionalize them by public policies or by market or other things, but to try to understand what are these relations that are before, and this informality is important. Having this in mind, all these things, territorial-based policy making at the different scales should be seen for us at the lens of the specificities of the southern peripheries. Those problems that we were raising before, when we are talking about this, and this probably is a general grid that we can apply to other things, but the idea is in terms of format and process, this is the framework that we are trying to apply to the specific problems that we have and that we were raising before. Finally, one of our objectives was also to make some kind of recommendations, it's a little strong maybe, regarding the EU support, but it's one of the components of reflection that we have to do, and by monitoring and assessing this project. And we were all talking about this in some of our meetings. and with all the people involved in the project. We are not questioning that part that is there in gray. What are the reasons for the cultural policy at the European level? We just assume that they exist, and they have that double feature, that on one hand to assume culture and creativity as the final end, and so have cultural policy as a traditional cultural policy, but on the other hand, that they enhance culture and creativity as a way for attain other objectives of sustainable development, to have economic growth, to have environment protection or urban regeneration, to have social inclusion, to have expression of diversity, of participation of people, citizenship. So all of these are objectives of policy at the level of European Union that can be addressed through culture and through cultural policies also. And so, assuming that as something that we are not discussing, we are here launching ideas at three levels. First is what should be supported, and then there is several challenges on this, departing from our experience in this project. On one hand, of course, this is the thing that all people talk about is the time, and time is needed, so the continuity of policies, continuity of support, not necessarily of subsidization, but that effects are seen in the long term, stability of action, maturation of processes need for everything. So policies should address that anyway, in terms of what should be supported and what can be the format for have that support. Another issue is the tension that we have been discussing so far several times also about support processes or support outcomes and results of it. Of course, most of us probably will defend that important process in a project like this, but this tension in terms of objectives is clear also in the European Union, and not only but in policy making. And the challenge is the balance between the two things. Then another thing that raised as important in this project is this idea of that particularly in some countries, and we talked about this yesterday also, the European cultural policies are a safe space for certain artistic creations and processes that have no space now in some countries because of the polarization, the radicalism in contemporary Europe, and the way that, at least in some countries, we expect not so much countries, but probably in more countries in the future, but that we have here some issues, at least, of traditional cultural policies and the space for alternative independent art scenes in many countries are at risk. And cultural policies can have here, European level cultural policies can have here a role. At least we expect. Second level, how to support this is another level of discussion. The balance here between the outcomes of the project for its beneficiaries, the end users, the communities, the territories, but also the artists, the institutions involved, that are also beneficiary at the end, in some cases, and the mechanisms for the sustainability of institutions that are many times beyond these kind of projects. And we are talking about institutions, we are talking about us. As partners, as cultural institutions, cultural promoters, universities, and so on and so on. So, this implies to reflect about how to assess the results of a project, the outcomes, not the inputs, the outcomes that we have, the outputs, other logics for monitoring and to have the results assessments, and I would stress this, to avoid the habituation, the dependence of the promoting institutions of this kind of funding. Of course, it's important for all of us, but in the side of European Union, I'm not sure if that should be the objective, I will argue. Even if of course, it's important, it's to explain why it's important our presence here in the middle, and what are you doing, and what the added value of having us here in the middle in this relation. This support probably should be targeted to its end users and not be used in terms of feed structures and parallel service. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking specifically about our institutions, but I'm talking about the use that our institution and the regulation and so on make us spend the money. Well, we were talking about this, for instance, parallelly with Fanny, for instance, outside the conference. But the money that we spend on travels or on meals and so on during these projects, and the way it, and even ethically, the way it should be taught when related to the end users of the projects. I'm finishing. And so, final thing, it's final layer, how to assess this. Which types of impacts measurement can we suggest? We can do it in several ways, and we can think a little bit more about this and suggest on individuals, on institutions, on territories, on communities. We are measuring different things at these levels. We can have more quantitative, more qualitative analysis, but the fundamental is to go beyond monetization of value and the reduction to economic. Even when we're talking about environment or social, we are reducing this to monetizing this, and it's not the solution, of course. So the multidimensionality of value, what is the artistic value, the social value, the cultural value, the environmental value that we have taking out of the project. And finally, one other thing, I will insist on this because we tend to of course, because it's natural for us and it's benefits for us to overemphasize the benefits, the positive externalities, but we also have responsibilities and negative externalities in our action, and we are also arming communities and territories, and that should be also measured with the noise that we made, with the problems that we made, and so on and so on and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The long applause means that it took a bit over 15 minutes, but it was worthwhile. Thank you so much. And now finally, Jasmina Husanovic, our dear colleague from the University of Tuzla, with the title Decolonial Approaches to Cultural Production in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Production of Possibilities for Participatory Democratic Practice. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Hold on a second, I just want to know what the time is. Okay, I'm really pleased to be here with you today, and I feel most grateful for the invitation to share some of my thoughts on my work, which is basically about emancipatory politics at the intersection between art, academia, and activism. I think that perhaps in some way my presentation maybe belonged yesterday better in terms of themes that I'm going to tackle, but I also sort of reoriented it a little bit in order to kind of also reflect on some things that were mentioned yesterday. So I'd like to kind of continue some dialogues that we have. So basically, I have been looking for many years how the politics of hope at these intersections oscillates between witnessing to trauma and loss, and on the other hand, the languages and politics of hope, solidarity, social justice, whilst resisting dystopic scenarios and structural violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the region, which perhaps could be best explained through the concept like Mbembe's concept of necropolitics which is basically his term for contemporary forms of subjugating life to the power of death that develops relations between resistance, sacrifice, and terror, and how the lives of citizens are being reduced to the living dead, to excluded communities, into the status of social death. or as some other authors would say, into sacrifice zones. On the other hand, also the concept of cannibal capitalism, which I find by Nancy Fraser, which is about the current moment that we are living in, where capitalism in its neoliberal phase basically devours, like a cannibal, democracy, care, and the planet and people. So these are, and she explores how democracy, care, the planet, and the people are being devoured. And also, I've been engaged in a lot of platforms and that are quite political and activist, and that basically also produce these possibilities and enact participatory democratic practices in various formats. So I just wanted to kind of continue this discussion here also, present discussion on the colonial, anti-capitalist and feminist imperatives, which must inform our local and transnational cultural policies in the European South or Southeast, whilst bringing together activists, scholars and artists in counter-hegemonic collaborative endeavors, and yesterday we talked about counter-publics, but basically towards promising participatory and ethical community relations. And I see many examples like of that in this current project. So my argument is that a lot of these practices are about a huge task, which is forging a new social bond in a way. So basically kind of cultural connections that also resuscitate this notion of social and public good, or the commons, through new democratic experiments and forms of citizenship. So one of the themes that I've been engaging is the notion of material effective infrastructures, which weaves together certain promising imaginaries, but I will get back to this notion a bit later on. But in a way, I'm also trying to think about these knots between time and labor, care and affect when it comes to resisting the symptoms of alienation, privatization, extraction and exploitation. So you've seen here that that I'm basically saying that somehow there is a very promising production, both in academia, art, and activism, of practical hope and critical hope through emancipatory pedagogies or critical pedagogies, how you want to, or feminist pedagogies, how we want to frame them. That enact something which, together with my colleague, in one of our articles, we have called community as academia. But in some other things, platforms that we did, we also phrased this also as the key question when we work together with these different audiences or different participants. How do we work together? Especially when you're working together, scholars, workers, students, activists, with workers who are striking, who are occupying their factory, and you're engaged in this effort for a number of years, like we've been with the DITA factory workers from 2010 to 2015. And especially because this somehow makes us, in a way, engage actively with this imperative to search for a community of equals that intervenes into difficult subjects, most difficult subjects today, through a reinvented classroom as activism, or activism as a classroom, so or art as a classroom. So those interventions, which include a common work of artists, theorists, students, activists, citizens, are an act of knowledge production that we build, where we build the stage to, and I'll quote Rancière here from Emancipated Spectator, where we build the stage in order to frame the story of a new adventure in a new idiom. The effect of idiom cannot be anticipated. It calls for spectators who are active interpreters, who render their own translation, who appropriate the story for themselves, and who ultimately make their own story out of it. What has to be done is a work of translation, showing how empirical stories and philosophical discourses translate each other. Producing a new knowledge meant inventing the idiomatic form that would make translation possible, end of quote. So in a way, it is, when we deal with most difficult losses and traumas that this region, former Yugoslavia, has been through, it is also about how can we at the same time testify collectively to the potentiality of a promising politics, whilst pulling on these different strands of academic, cultural, activist, artistic production, who share underneath a common pedagogy, and through the attempt to somehow give creative ability to the loss, to huge loss, huge catastrophes when it comes to post-war, post-socialist transition, and trying to somehow see where, how to have emancipatory politics and where the subject of this emancipatory politics appears and how. So it is pertinent maybe to emphasize this, that critical pedagogies are important, have been important to us because they focus on the practices of cultural criticism and analysis that engender classroom as an emancipated community, which is in fact a community of storytellers and translators. And there is a strong legacy in the former Yugoslav region of actors and spectators in this communal space of knowledge production, transforming the relationship of inequality into a community of equals. And obviously, this work has to be furthered and also quite informed by latest things that we learned from decolonial theory or from ecofeminism or eco-socialism or in general critical theory today. So because I think it's a cooperative learning process that is not just local, it is global, but it is universal as well, and it must be outside the transitional walls of institutionalized classroom culture, because it must be practice-oriented, non-authoritarian, building on the experiences, insights, and affects around text and stories of everyday life, its practice and politics. And as we know that basically at the same time, this is like working on different sides of potential social movements in a social movement, at least in the field of knowledge production, but also much wider than that often. In order to kind of continue conversations that bring together a complex world of audiences, their stories, passions, and experiences into a public classroom framed as a community of equals, where we together produce maps of knowledge and action that somehow make this switch from the hopeless politics of loss by inventing a public language of hope. And these new public languages of communality and hope in various sites is something that led me to perhaps here mention one particular play, theater play, My Factory, that was directed by Selma Spahic, a very famous director regionally. She works also regionally, but she did this play in the Bosnian National Theatre in Zenica in 2017, and it's a fantastic play that talks about basically about what happened to Zenica and the key factory around which the whole city was built, the steel factory that was destroyed during the war and then bought by ArcelorMittal, and then basically both the life and the pre-war socialist life and somehow the post-war death of Zenica as a city is connected to these topics. And the play itself was based on the intimate monography by a famous Bosnian author, Seledin Avdic, My Factory, but it also engaged actors and basically became something else. This was just the inspiration, and collectively the actors, but also later on the audience, participated in trying to somehow research the feeling of the town that still belongs to them, and the experiences and memories, and it is not completely stolen to them, especially because at the heart of this local identity was the notion of factory as a home, as a mother, this big factory, steel factory, the biggest in former Yugoslavia, and also at the heart of this was the workers' family, kind of conjoined this oikos with the factory itself. So also dramaturgist was Amina Omerovic, who did a great job. But I wanted to connect somehow these themes to, it was very important that it showed in 2017 because it was quite timely, but it was also unique because a lot of art in Bosnia and Herzegovina has not responded actively or proactively to protests and plenums that happened in 2014, 15, and 16, and workers' protests. So this was one of the rare, proper participatory engagements in working through some of these themes after plenums and Bosnian Spring of 2014, and later on the occupation and restarting Dita factory. This was very important to many of us. Because also inside the Workers' University that we set up with the workers of Dita factory, which is a factory in Tuzla that we were working with for 6-7 years until it was privatized, but for 6-7 at least it wasn't like completely stripped of assets, and some workers remained, and it started producing, but they really had this intent to completely destroy it and leave people on the street. So in another part of my research, I explored this theme of protesting for production. What does that mean in larger terms? And how the occupation of the Dita workers cut into the very matrix of dominant property relations, and how basically the effective infrastructures and belonging worked here together with Dita workers and all the community, the whole community that supported it. And especially this question is pertinent: to whom does the factory belong? But we can ask this question: to whom does this belong? Whose property is this? That is really cutting into the trinity between culture, economy, politics, by reclaiming, fiercely reclaiming unbribable, effective infrastructure which is socially owned. It's already 15 minutes, so not to go too much into other theoretical stuff, I wanted to say that in thinking about these affective compositions and affective and desire for the social good against the antisocial logic of capitalism, its constitutive death drive, I found inspiration in decolonial thought of Denise Ferreira de Silva, or Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who talk about undercommons, etc., and which somehow underwrite or shadow the common. But also there is a great author, Angela Mitropoulos, who talks about the notion of infrastructure and what it basically means, and these connections, relationalities between us. And I'll end with her quote, which is: infrastructure, after all, is about how worlds are made, how forms of life are sustained and made viable. To think of politics as infrastructural is to set aside questions of subjectivity, identity, demands, promises, rights, and contracts, and instead to render visible the presumptions that the knots of attachment, adherence, care, or fondness have already tied by nature or supposedly incontestable forms of connection, such as kinship, race, money, sexuality, nation, and so on. So the materialities of infrastructure render it the most pertinent political question there is. Everything else is a distraction. So infrastructure is the undercommons, neither the skilled virtuosity of the artisan, nor the regal damask, nor the jacquard loom that replaced, reproduced, and democratized them, but the weave. So it's the weave. So basically, this is something, this desire for the weave is something that I see as most alive today when we have collaborative endeavors between art, academia, and activism. Thank you very much. There was some other, I had this, but I forgot. So there are some photos from the play. That was really a cathartic experience and still is for
Thank you once again. We have time for questions and for a discussion. I like this part most. So now I won't make my position privileged than yours. So please don't be shy. I know, Professor, you have the first question to go, please, but we need a microphone. Professor Milena.
Okay. Lilian and me recently have finished a text, which is now under reviewing, about citizens' diplomacy, in fact, how to complement all the lacks and everything of cultural diplomacy. So both of you have done very inspirational I would say I think for both of us. For example, when Pedro was speaking about the deficit of recognition, that is something that we try to see, and that is something I would like that maybe we can discuss here with practitioners. UNESCO had tried with Convention 2005 to offer instruments, which is called Convention, 2005, preferential treatment. But our analysis of quadriennial periodic reporting of the whole world, we took 100 countries that reported, was no use of preferential treatment, of fair cultural cooperation, of global north giving any advantage. Or contrary, the most used instrument of cultural policy within Convention 2005, which is meant cultural cooperation, is instruments to support export. By which countries? Global North. Canada, for example, is the leading one, with 15 different cultural policy instruments to stimulate Canada creative industry exports toward countries of Global South. So my question would be, how we, because that was in fact topic of our, one of the topics of, because we have written two texts recently together, was how we, cultural practitioners, activists and so on, how we can change practices of official cultural diplomacy, which I have to admit, I never thought in economic terms when Luis asked, who is paying for English, Spanish, whatever language courses, French, in such expensive buildings in center of Belgrade? By the way, it's us. That's the way how countries, I mean, those of us who want their grandchildren to go to French kindergarten and so on, I mean, you pay for that, but that's the only way how those countries Spain, France, and so on, can still keep prestigious buildings in the center of the city, which, by the way, United States gave up. And United States, in fact, quit the building which today belongs to Cervantes Institute, because for them it was expensive. So for the richest country in the world. So it's again very strange economy that teaching language courses by foreign institute, Austrian Cultural Forum also, Goethe and so on, is in fact ruining our quite well-developed system of teaching foreign languages, which existed throughout the socialist time. I learned French and English at the Institute for Foreign Languages, in school also, but mostly there. So, and it was working. So it's very interesting because they want to keep prestigious, but can you imagine Institute Cervantes in a small building with a small rent? I mean, that wouldn't be good for image. So they have, or French Institute to keep the prestigious and so on. So, but how they can sustain that? By giving courses paid very low, the native, for example, French speakers to give courses. They're all on the base of 1 year throughout. Goethe Institute also. The contract, and then they dismiss. They don't prolong contracts, because if you prolong contracts with the language teacher, you have to raise salary for the language teacher. So you always take beginners and gave them the lowest possible. So economy, I'm sorry for usurpating, and also I just, and then I will not take anymore. For Yasmina, thank you very much for raising many important issues on this intersection of activism, academia, art, cultural policy, specifically for showing that on Selma Spahic performance. She's really very well-known artist throughout the region, but that is issue that artists are probably the only force throughout the region, in all of our societies, that are, at least through their artistic work, reminding on what used to be position of the labor class, what used to be self-governance. For example, the only remnants of self-governance you had possibility to see. It was the magazine, Circle Performance was there, and I just like to raise this issue. They go again, okay? So it's, you might speak with the people, how they're organizing, how they're planning. That's the only space that continue to be self-governed space in culture, which was general manner of Yugoslav self-governing socialism once upon a time. Sorry for taking a long, but...
Would you like to respond? To have more. Okay, then I'll take the privileged part just for Professor, because I'm so much inspired by what Professor Milena said. Actually, you mentioned it in your presentation about these expensive buildings. I myself, by the way, went to the Cervantes Institute for Spanish language. But it's also part of the, so to say, geopolitical and I would say geostrategic dependency of us towards other countries. So it was not only because the United States, it was too expensive for them, because you remember what actually happened with the building. So they didn't want to go back there. And they will have a new center in the very luxurious space. I'm sure you will know soon. But what I would just maybe invite all of you to just kind of reflect in regards to your presentations. No one mentioned the center, word center, which in this relationship, structural, is very important. We are all looking towards some centers. Some of us want to move from the peripheral position. I'm talking about states, even cities. Some are fine with the position at being at the periphery. But what is needed to become semi-periphery, if you like? Because we are all, in a way, being, I won't use the tough word, but treated in an unfair way in regards to production, but also distribution of our work, of goods, etc. So this dependency in this relationship is, I would say, a crucial word in this structural relationship, of course. But you can use also examples, not to stay only in this abstract theorizing of things. Okay, now more questions and comments, please. Yes?
Hi, thank you for, I don't know, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question to do. Well, the last decades, a phenomenon is observed, which is that of the very big institutions visiting the European South and the European East for, presenting and organizing events. I will mention big-scale events. I will mention two of them, the Manifesta 3 in Ljubljana and the Documenta 14 in Athens in 2017. So I would like to know what is your opinion about that? I mean, how could peripheries respond to that? Considering also a reconsideration of what we are, which is our identity, because we come from the European South, but we do not belong to the global South, which is also related to the concepts of blackness and whiteness, because colors are what they are, but colors are also concepts and ideas, and yeah, that's the question.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. More, please. Provocations? Comments? No?
Provocations always.
Always, Tanya, please.
Now, for Professor Husanovic, I'm interested in why you decide to speak about knowledge production. Do you see the idea of producing knowledge as emancipatory, critical, or feminist? I'm thinking, are we really producing knowledge, or is knowledge already existing and then we are exchanging, or what are we actually doing with the knowledge, and is why are you deciding to use really the vocabulary of producing it? To Pedro, I was thinking why preserving informalities in policy making is positive. In our societies, we very often think about informalities in policy making as an obstacle towards more democratic, more participatory, more transparent. So maybe a little bit of reflection on why informality is good. And then to Professor Bonnet, you were saying that mobility is a cultural dominant logic. When you were talking about economic dominant logics and then geopolitical dominant logics, and then mobility was one of the dimensions that are, for you, cultural dominant logic. Are you really thinking this way? And maybe can you comment on the asymmetries in terms of mobility when in international cultural collaboration and cultural policy? I think this mobility is very often also politically motivated, economically motivated. So is that a trap that we think that mobility is always culturally dominant logic?
Thank you so much. Is this enough questions now that you can respond? Okay, I'll move there.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for comments and questions, and I will briefly actually tackle this question, a huge question. We can really, I think, deserves a special panel to talk about what does decoloniality mean in the European South, which is a form of South, because you have the processes of racialization also happening there. And there is, you mentioned, what does that mean, the center doing this and that. The problem is that there is, even on the art scene or theoretical scene or knowledge production scene, the logic of extraction. Our knowledge or experiences or insights are also being extracted and reproduced elsewhere in the center, and then they come back to us in some sort of quite often problematic form. But so this is somehow a kind of double injury. So this logic of extraction and extractivism in arts and in academia has to be exposed all the time. I mean, it really has to be called upon. We should not keep silent to it, and it's just not this just attempt, okay, how can we be assimilated into the center, but how can we really problematize the center and all the practices that are ongoing? And I can bring, yesterday I had an example, but I don't want to bother you with that when we were discussing it, and I was looking for a reference, and then I found a reference, and then I also figured out what kind of work has been done globally that has obviously been based on the work that was done locally and has not been mentioned at all in the process. In the art scene, pretty big things and important things. So anyway, but the second one, why do I use the term producing? Mostly because I want to acknowledge that for knowledge you need time and energy, i.e. you need labor. And these notions of time and energy are really important in terms of how we come to knowledge, and whether it's experiential, whether it's subconscious, whether it's something that comes to us, intuitively or through suffering, or there are all sorts of ways of and theories of how knowledge comes about. But I keep the word producing because I think it implies this kind of labor by activists, artists, and academics together in order to produce this knowledge together. And that requires time and energy. And if we are talking about affective weaves, we also have to talk about affective depletion, because our capacities are being depleted all the time. Our times and energies are really scattered all over the place. We were all mentioning that. So maybe infrastructure is, according to Metropolis, the most important political question for her, and it's really important. But I would say that the matter of political time is also crucial. And how do we produce time for politically engaged, for instance, art? That's also something that I think is important. Or this even Freire or Williams, they talk about the production of practical hope. So we have to really maybe we can talk also about reproduction, but it's about labor for sure. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I'll try to tackle several things, but the first, the question of the deficit in the recognition and the preferential treatment. Let me be an economist on this, in terms of more orthodox, in terms of if the preferential treatment is not working and the incentives are not working, I would argue that, particularly for our situation, it would be important to establish other kind of restriction or incentives in terms of political instruments. That is to establish quotas, for instance, at the European level, for instance, for a Southern coalition, or for addressing the South or the East or wherever, or what specificities, to establish specific calls for that. At a national level, if we are regions that are not able to surpass that deficit of recognition or artistic practices or kinds of artistic practices, to have specific calls for that, at least temporary, in order to recover that. Because I think effectively the incentives would go to the mechanism that was also said, that the center goes to the periphery and the center extracts, enhances extractivism at all. So I would argue in that more economic direction, but as another kind of restriction more than an incentive in that case. Regarding the centers, and the centers, we had that huge discussion in the first conference in Lisbon about the centers and the peripheries. We are not tackling this here. I don't know if Gerhard would want to talk about this later also. But we have here, we want to be the center, or some of us want to be the center, and that a mechanism regarding the way to achieve the center or some kind of centrality, but we also want not to be the center, and not to be the center, to be the periphery, particularly in artistic or in some kinds of cultural work and some artistic fields, is an advantage and can be an advantage, not just because we are a periphery, but to be different and to be and to stay with all the difference as competitive advantage. So this tension between becoming center or not becoming center is something that, and our intermediate. That's why I was saying that our intermediate position, not being north or being south, not being center, not being periphery, could be an advantage also, and could be addressed as a target for public policies, because we are not, there are policies for the peripheries, there are policies, or no need of policies for the center, but maybe we need addressing specific fringes or specific or temporary or wherever things for this intermediate space. Margins are inactive and are an active resource that is explored economically and symbolically and artistically by the artistic processes, and that is important and that's interesting, and that is a way of doing it, and it can be also be forced by policies. But I think the intermediate situation is not quite addressed by the policies, and that can be something that our Southern Coalition could advocate, and could advocate the importance of the effect of the network on that. And so that's why this dichotomy between north, south, black, white, and so on, it's not so, you are completely right, it's not enough. And could lead to those extractivist behaviors that we have with the central institutions to go there and do all the things. And so, again, specific policies, for instance, the quotas, the specific calls, and so on, could be done, or specific funding mechanisms for areas or regions with certain specificities, again, should be addressed. Then we have the problem that is the first problem. How can we market our problems, marketing our problems? How can we, not just our reputation as South and periphery and cultural agents in the South and the periphery, but why is our problem in the periphery different from the others? And why it must be addressed in terms of public policies? That, I think, is the challenge in terms of convincing the funders and the public policies. Regarding informality, that is something that we work very much on that. Informality can be formality can be an advantage, for instance, in market labor and so on, and for in market labor, or for all these buildings that we have here, and we are cultural agents as we could. But informality can be an opportunity also, and can be the way of things happen, because if we don't have certain level of informality, many cultural activities, and I would risk half of the creativity in many cities would disappear, because it happens in cities that have no license, that have no access for disabilities, that have no extinctor for fire, that have all those things. If we be strict in the formality in terms of public policy, and that is a problem for public policy, or in terms of marketing, entering the market, those activities, we just kill the activities, we just kill the creativity. So the level of informality is fundamental for the existence of alternative and independent art scenes. Of course, with this, I'm not legitimating at all that we should not have decent salaries, or that we should have flexibility in the labor market. It's a completely different thing. But it needs informality because there are many governance mechanisms in which the cultural activities are relying that are not the market and public policies, much more in relations, intimate relations between people, informal trade between people that are fundamental for the existence of the things.
Well, I agree with most of what you said, so I will try not to repeat. But I think that all of us, we are at the same time in hegemonic and not hegemonic positions. And we use this. And this is a game. And we have to accept, in a way, that there is an hypocritical position. So we kind of, and that's why I think this dichotomy between global north, global south is not enough rich to express all the behaviors, the existing behaviors and the contradictions that all of us, we have. I think when you realize that you are not only in the center, but you are as well in a periphery, this is a wonderful way to start understanding the others, creating empathic alliances, self-criticizing your own position, accepting that we are part of the dominant culture, and we are part of the elites in many ways. I think it's important because, of course, we can easily be just or in a very uncritical position because I'm a minority, I'm part of a minority, and this is very easy to be uncritical. Or, and I think, of course, we have to criticize the misuse of, for example, the 2005 UNESCO Convention by some of the countries who push for that, because Canada and France were the leading countries at this very moment. But of course, this is part of the contradiction. So for me, the most important thing is try not to repeat what we criticize. For instance, I see some of my former students developing satellite festivals in other parts of the world. So they started with a very innovative festival in Barcelona, and some years later, they received the possibility to do something in Sao Paulo, in Buenos Aires, and for them, this is, okay, it's normal, it's a possibility, why not? And they act in a way following this neoliberal logic. So when I first talk about the three logics, the geostrategic logic, the commercial export kind of logic, and the genuine cultural logic, I knew very well that the last one is the weakest one. But in any case, I wanted to underline that for many cultural operators, this is the real reason for being involved in cultural cooperation, even though this is the weakest reason, okay? But I think we need, in any case, to be able to understand our own contradictions, and from our own contradictions, try to build a better world. And that's, I think, the kind of good practice and example that a project like A Stronger Peripheries is giving us. The possibility to reflect from the peripheries, understanding that we are not only peripheries, we are also part of the center of the hegemonic culture. And that is, I think, be aware of this contradiction is the starting point for trying to do things a little bit better.
It would be really honest to finish with this very wise message that you gave us. Thank you all panelists very much. Thank you for being active audience. Now, if someone from the organization would come up and say a few 20 minutes break. Okay, 20 minutes break, then means rush. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, good morning. We start again. It's a great pleasure to introduce our two guest speakers of this roundtable, of this debate that we will organize. It will be a dialogue between, for one side, and he will start, Federico Escrival. Federico Escrival comes from Buenos Aires. He's professor there in the University of Buenos Aires, and he had developed a very rich career as well as a civil servant working in the field of culture, and also this reflection approach what he's doing at the university. And in my right side, my dear colleague, friend, Emmanuel Negrier, that you know very well because it's part of our project from the very beginning. And Emmanuel, he's a CNRS researcher in Montpellier, the University of Montpellier, political scientist. So between both of them, they will just discuss about South and peripheries in collaborative artistic strategies. So we will have this approach, and Federico will start in a way contextualizing a little bit his own experience from a periphery, in this case the Latin American periphery, and the case Emmanuel will try to answer some of the questions that Federico selected from a quite long list of potential questions. He selected 3 questions, so Emmanuel will just react to that. So it will be not each one doing their own speech, but something more a dialogue. In any case, Federico prepares a couple of slides in order to just contextualize his point of view. So he's starting, but you will see later, it will be just a debate among us. So please, Federico, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good morning to everyone. Let's see how this works. Okay. First, I'd like to show you a slide video in case any of you don't know where my city is located, but mostly for showing you a characteristic of my region that I would like to take as a starting point for the description, that it's the strong inequality. We all know and we all share the conviction that we live in an unbearable, unequal world and unequal society, and we have this 50,000 people slum 3 kilometers away from the last scene that we saw, that it's the neighborhood of Puerto Madero, that it's like the image of opulence in Buenos Aires, that it's my city. But first of all, I need to tell you that I'm very proud of being here. I'm very honored of being in the Balkans, of being in Belgrade. I would like to thank all the workers of this venue and all the work in layers that made me possible to be here. I've been watching at that lamp for 2 days maybe, and I'm thinking that in all my life I've been devoted to building it, I still wouldn't make it. So these layers of culture, language, and assembled work made it possible for us to get together and for me to be here, and I'm very honored by it. I'm very thankful with the Southern Peripheries team, for the FDA team that organized this, and was very precise in each of the devices that made this conference. Obviously with Professor Milena for the extremely generous invitation that allowed me to be here sharing these ideas with you, and for both Emmanuel and Luis for its fraternity, their friendship, and their commitment for thinking this space that we are now starting. And I would like to highlight something that I saw in the website of the project, that is this, I would say wrongly as many things, sorry for that, but it's like this handbook on happiness. Manual on working happiness. And I think the idea of happiness is quite revolutionary, because we will dive into that later. So I won't bring a Latin American perspective, but a South American perspective, and that South American identity is not geographically based, but a term from political science. I will go there right now. This was the linguistic diversity of my region in 492. A few years later, all these populations were just Indians. And because of a very rich and lovely country that they didn't get to know of its existence. And I think this image might cipher some of the debates we discussed yesterday with Luis and with Emmanuel, and that I will try to summarize very quickly, leaving lots of holes, and sorry for that, but I have to summarize the history of our region for maybe 500 years in 2 minutes. So let's do it. Some moments that I would like to highlight. First, we have like 15,000 years of history in that diverse perspective, summarized and mainly erased from our own narratives. This complex sociocultural and linguistic diversity that included mathematics, astronomy, writing, ceremonial burying, architecture, complex fiscal structures that inhibit the possibility of hunger in the way we know it, and exclusion, radical exclusion in the way we know it in modern contemporary societies. Even though there was oppression, there was human sacrifices and stuff, but there is some history there to be recovered. Then the colonial intervention, the colonial trauma, this idea of the discovery of America, that it's very Western-based because we were already there, not to be discovered, and there were Viking settlements in the north of America, so the idea of America was not that unknown to be discovered, but it's more a political invention of the discovery. The cultural highlight I want to extract of that moment is the instrumentalization by the colonial conquest of pre-existing ethnical and political tensions in order to give this colonial rule that lasted more or less between the middle of the 16th century and early 1800s, and that this brought mainly hybridization, miscegenation, articulation of resistance to this colonial rule that mixed different dimensions, military resistances, also of low productivity, that was the argument that brought the colonial rule to introduce the enslaved African population, because native populations won't produce as much as they were expected to, and also cultural resistances. And this brought also the descent of more or less the 80% of the American population, that it's calculated to be between 54 million and 100 million people. 80% of that number came down, not only because of the military intervention, but of diseases, and also, and this I'd like to stress, massive suicides. These massive suicides were a form of resistance in order to avoid acculturation and to live this Western style of life that for us came from the East. That's also something tricky. And that it's not only economical and political transformative, but it's also in philosophical, ontological, conceptual, cultural, and symbolic terms. For instance, this idea of territory and this idea of time that Western imposed territory as an area to be colonized, to be owned, to be expoliated foreign resources, it does not fit in the traditions of American philosophies. Territory was more like circuits, and that were, I need to hurry, I know, sorry. But this separation between cultura and natura does not fit, and it's in the base of current cultural debates. The other idea is this of time, this lineal, accumulative, progressive time, this future ahead. Future for indigenous conceptions is in the past because we haven't seen it, we don't know how it is, but past is ahead because we've seen it, and it's that tractions us to action. So the moment of independence and fragmentation brought in the development of a state, of a strategy of modernization and westernization, with also strong immigration policies. And this was the betrayal of this criollo population that articulated with indigenous, mestizo, Afro-descendant populations to get rid of the colonial rule, but afterwards used that power to build a state that reproduced this same orientation of westernization and was the base of what is called, and it's also work by Professor Milena in a book for this region, this idea of self-colonization, pedagogical colonization. I will only use from here, that these enlightened elites that defined what was cultural legitimate in the face of these new states based on this North Atlantic cultural matrix, and this idea to repeat London in the economics and Paris in the cultural sphere, needed to build nation states with official historiographies, pantheons, symbols, etc., in order to dismantle, disaggregate, and it will be here maybe. I will also avoid this. Why South America? Because Latin America was expressed firstly in 1830 by Maurice Chevalier for Napoleon III as a way for French increasing its ascent towards the region as a form of neo-colonialism. We have this Pan-Americanism idea that brings the United States as a new regulation of the 19th century starting colonization, and some ideas of integration, maybe in the idea of Nuestra América, elaborated by the Cuban thinker José Martí in the late in 890, and this idea of Patria Grande. So there is a struggle between thinking our own, organizing politically on our own, and these constant imperial interventions. And South America, it's not a geographical context because it also brings in Central America. Why? Because it's everything that it's post south of this new North American empire, that it has a great ascendance throughout the 20th century. In the first half of the century, we had this development of cultural institutionality following these processes of national democracies. We were involved in some regard in this non-aligned movement. The question of Professor Milena from 2 days ago, we still do have some symbolic resources regarding that kind of anti-imperialism in culture, but it's nowadays very counter-hegemonic. So even these processes that at the middle of the 20th century tried to establish democracy and involve these oppressed majorities, repeated in cultural perspective this westernization and started developing a Ministry of Culture, as the French had done, or a National Endowment for the Arts, or a National Fund for the Arts in this arm's length principle. At the middle of the century, the states started paying attention to the region again. It was the doctrine of national security, so we started to use this idea of the intern enemy that was elaborated in a racist perspective for indigenous, that in the case of Argentina were not killed by the colonial rule as much as they were by the modern free state of Argentina. It was a moment of intensification of this Western project of modernization that was brought, that was brought at the last of the 19th century while establishing schools and bringing in, we still do have in Argentinian constitution in the 25th article, the promotion of European immigration as an objective for our nation. And this made us also, in a good perspective, have a 70% rate of literacy by the end of the 19th century, that it's quite high for global standards. And Luis encouraged me to say that this is also what makes the possibility for me to be here today and share these insights on South America. But while I will, how am I in time, already too close, okay. What I need to tell you is that, in this moment, this internal enemy tended to be the organized worker, the socialist militant, and this modality of political treatment of this inner difference is now being used towards artists, cultural producers, cultural organizations, social organizations. So I have no time. I'm very bad with my timing. Sorry for this. Going backwards. I will skip the part on which I intended to speak about cultural practices, artistic interventions, and democratization in the 80s. this idea of integrationist political strength in the middle of the 2010, 10 years ago, and the way it affected or did recognize cultural diversity and popular organization in the arts and culture, main policy innovations and limitations of these years, and to bring Emmanuel in, and sorry for the extension, there is a movement towards these new rights, these neo-fascist rights. We are having now a president that poses the extinction of the state as such, that businessmen who avoid paying taxes are national heroes. And, well, I guess it's time for you to come on. And this idea of cultural wars, that it's present also in the States, that Bolsonaro was like the laboratory in a region in Brazil, and that is now coming to Argentina too, and trying to establish a new laboratory to think how these rights, these new alt-rights can build its hegemony for the next years. So thank you, and sorry for the...
Contextualization. Now to start this dialogue. So now, probably because I'm not sure, Emmanuel will probably try to do a conceptualization of the theories and try to just connect and try to answer some of the questions. But the idea is now is a dialogue between both of them.
Okay, thank you. I join Federico to thank you for this very nice organization, and I'm very glad to be here with you. I come from southern France, in a region whose name is Occitanie, where has been born the notion of internal colonialism. That is to say that, as Milena stated over yesterday, we are all the peripheral of someone else. And I would like to begin, perhaps apparently detached from Federico's point. I would like to begin by recalling the three main series of international relations, not to give a good point to one and bad to the other, but to try to draw from these theories the way to understand well the situation and perhaps the way to act in a more efficient way and perhaps in a more ethical way. The three major theories of international relations are the following. The first is the realism or new realism. That is to say, the explanation of behavior of international actors is based on asymmetric resources, selfish nature of the player involved. War is always possible, and this theory is very close to Thomas Hobbes' philosophy. Thomas Hobbes' philosophy, the man is a wolf for the man, homo homini lupus. The second theory is the liberal theories that favors the notion of interdependence, cooperation. The master term for the first theory, realist, is sovereignty. The master term for the second theory, following Immanuel Kant, is cooperation. And the third theory is constructivism. What does it mean? Constructivism means that actors don't behave following interest, following cooperative learnings. They behave following representations and emotion. And critically, constructivism tells to realism, but why actors, knowing perfectly their own interest, are making so many errors? This is a question errors derive from their own perceptions, emotions, representations. And against the liberal attitude, constructivism ensures that behind nice discourses, liberal discourses, subtle forms of tyranny may prosper. And I think that these three theories may help us to understand and may help us to act. And I will briefly present the both with an example of your point about neoliberalism and the firms that are concerned by this neoliberalism development. Asking one question. In general, when we assess, naturally, in our world, that some big companies, multinational companies, play a huge and growing role in the cultural field. I'm talking about, for instance, IEG and Schultz Entertainment Company, Live Nation, or the French Vivendi, for instance. And often the argument against the growing importance of these companies is the fact that there are a danger for cultural diversity and artistic diversity. And working on this point, I found no evidence that there was any decline of artistic diversity through the role they play in copyright of artists, in ownership of venues, in organization of festivals, and so on. The problem is not here. The problem is elsewhere. And if we qualify the problem, it would be not the decline of artistic diversity, but on the contrary, the instrumentalization of such diversity in order to develop business. Business that means that on this aesthetic diversity, big companies prosper in formatting the productions, confiscating the rents, capturing the artistic margin for capital, and so on and so forth, and nonetheless formatting artistic production in the sense of a flow economy, accelerated renewal of trends and successes, far from any social roots. So, in that perspective, what has to be done if we consider this landscape come undesirable? I think that we have to act on three domains. The first domain is an institutional one. It is the use of instruments contesting abuses of dominant position. It is very simple. The second way is a collective action. That means, and it has been underlined yet already, the solidarity between independent players to resist the influence of the oligopoly in the cultural field. And nonetheless, the third dimension is the individual educational action, because the influence of these companies, of this way to define what is art and culture, is also the object of a voluntary servitude. And the voluntary servitude is treated not by institutional instruments, but by educational means. So, as you see, and to conclude on this point, to to understand and to act, we need to take into account interests, to be realist, institutional game, to be liberal, and emotions, to be constructivist. Thank you.
So now I will ask Federico to react to these three domains of action that Emmanuel is proposing. So what do you think from a Latin American point of view? Do you think this is a good way, or the institutional approach is too weak or not exactly everywhere? It's not the same situation in capital cities or in the peripheries of the peripheries, because when we talk about Latin America, we have to talk about peripheries of peripheries. What do you think about collective action? What is happening in a moment that neoliberal values are impregnating society? And what do you think about the individual education action, which used to be what makes Latin America a little bit different of other colonial parts of the world, in the sense that there were a very clear educational strategy at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that allows really that the middle class emerge through education. Maybe because there were, of course, an idea of giving skills to people in order to improve productivity in countries based on an extractive model, and trying to go from this extractive model to a more industrial-based kind of model.
Due to my inability of synthesis, I may answer the third one with the first one, because the institutional model was Western-based, so it didn't aim at development or distribution of goods or sustainability in environmental terms, but to the sustainability of that Westernization project. So that's one of the problems, and I'm very interested in Professor Milena's work on adaptable quality management, because it makes that so much sense to context like us, and it's being posed in the last presentation as well. We are not able to get planification for next year, because next week our country will be absolutely radically different. So this kind of context needs new approaches and new skills in this third perspective. But what we really need is a radical revision of the state and institutionality, for it not to be based on the interests of these corporative global networks, but to rethink the state as an ambit of possibility for democratization, the exercise of rights, and a new social model and a new social contract that is now extinguished as we knew it. So I guess cultural organizations have a lot to do with that, not only for unblocking political imagination, and it was posed yesterday by a colleague here speaking about this idea of Jameson, that it's easier to understand the end of the end of the world and the end of capitalism, of the end of social relationships as nowadays. And it's easy for me to see why popular organizations don't think as the state as anything as the enemy, because we have been having the state as an oppressor for mainly 500 years and 200 years in its actual format. But now that we see that it's the main objective of these counter-democratic corporations, it seems to me that that's the way of building. And we need to resemble these solidarity links, international, but within our country. Ecological movements are one side, cultural organizations are just thinking about aesthetics and languages, based on this fine arts idea that was brought from France a couple of centuries ago, and that makes absolutely no sense. There is no way of thinking of aesthetics without thinking of ethics in a region. Cultural and political are totally intertwined. We've discussed this with Professor Belfiore in Santiago in December. And, well, I think that might be some ideas.
I don't know if you want to react, Emmanuel. Later I will ask you just to be thinking on how to manage uncertainty, because I think this is something that we can learn a lot in this part of the world. No, but you know, we need to learn from you, because we are going to uncertain times as well here, And I think that's something that we need to learn from your experience. And because in a way, cultural cooperations, in the best way, is a win-win process, that we learn from others just because we are exposed to the reality of others, and the capacity to contextualize, but at the same time to understand how to apply some strategies. That is something that we win, and that's one of the reasons why we are interested from a genuine point of view on cultural cooperation. But I just give the floor to Emmanuel.
But one of the difficulties is that culture, from an international perspective, has two faces, like Janus, the god of beginnings, endings, and transitions. The first face is the way to do war with an additional resource. Culture is going hand in hand with militaries, with economic interests. And it is particularly the case nowadays with very traditional weapons, nationalist, and with new weapons too, new words, such as, for instance, influence, branding, and so on. This is the first phase of culture. The second phase of culture is, on the contrary, the critical capacity of culture to deny legitimacy to war, to dominance, to economic interest, and so on, and on the contrary, to promote a goodwill, Eleonora, a goodwill behavior based on culture. And the problem now is that the first version of the two phases is very powerful, much more powerful than the second way. Perhaps after the Second World War, the second acception of culture was dominant, but now it is the first one. So what do we have to do in that perspective? Naturally, first, to strengthen this critical capacity, and in the Yasmina words, I would say the intersectional capacity of culture to deal with the diversity of population, of expectations, of representations and emotions. The second aspect we have to underline is the necessity to recall and insist on the autonomy of cultural relationship with regard with strategic and economic international relationship, even if the difference is not so easy to do. I just give an example. In that moment, France is living a very colonial difficulty with New Caledonia. And facing this problem, the presence of France in New Caledonia has, in a context, in a more general context, is confronted to the cultural strategy of China in this Pacific region. And it is not easy to solve the problem. There is a debate on the fact that whatever the colonialist behavior of France is now, is it comparable to the extractive or neo-extractive strategy of China, in particular on nickel, passing through apparent cultural relationships? And it is a very huge problem, not only for France, but for the populations in that region.
So how we have to react to these kind of situations, and what you learn in relation to be able to react both, because I think now Emmanuel is just incorporating a new layer, which is the battle between different imperialistic logics, and how the locals who are in a way just suffering, but at the same time being the subject of this kind of situation. So how do you react in this restructuration of the geostrategic powers? But I want, in any case, to connect with my previous question, the ones that you didn't yet answer, about how to manage and what we can learn from your experience of dealing with uncertain times.
Well, first of all, to recover the actuality of colonialism, because when we discuss about these topics, at least in Argentina, it's always posed like 200 years ago when the Spaniards were, and we don't get to see the real nowadays occupation of Malvinas on the part of the British Empire. It's not well known the presence of France in the Amazonas, for instance. So first of all, it's again education, and I guess culture has adapted in that regard, because as I said earlier, we are looking too much about languages and the legitimized circuits and this kind of imposed cosmopolitanism that also is the one that allows me to be here, disguising in some sense, because anyone that can occupy this seat is not as close to the popular cultures movement in Argentina as I should to be able to fully represent. I try to have a commitment towards that gap, to recognize it and to be critical about it, but speaking English, having my middle school ended, even at university level, already poses me as part of that governing elites, maybe in a peripheral perspective, but so education, and also the reconciliation for this aiming profound social and world global transformations. That was something that was discussed yesterday in the groups, and that's something I fear a lot. This idea of, okay, my cultural project can manage to transform in an extremely local perspective, but we already resigned the idea of changing the world, because that's too much for us, and that's totally understandable. But when we lose the possibility of changing the world based on our practices, we already lost the game. And I guess that's something very important to be recovered, because sorry for bringing that much of an Argentinian experience in the table, but these ideas that our actual president, Javier Milei, has, and the abolishment of the state and blah, is one kind of Austrian economy school that no one knew about 10 years ago in Argentina, that was quite peripheral in academical terms. Economists said, okay, that's, and nowadays they're running one of the main countries of our region, and one of the main countries in terms of lithium possession, that it's a strategical resource nowadays. And he's asking each week Elon Musk to receive him, to go and say, I can give you all the lithium we have, but let's do a picture for X. And as dumb as it sounds, that's the dynamics of our 50 million people country nowadays. So I guess the cultural sector, and I encourage my local and national cultural sector and our regional cultural sector, should address these topics. That's why I started with this inequity image, because there's no legitimacy in the cultural sector of thinking about purely or exclusively about aesthetics in the most unequal region of this unequal world. So I guess I didn't answer as well.
I want to incorporate an idea for me that I like a lot when Amartya Sen talks about human development, and says that this is the capacity to decide the kind of life you wish. So giving the empowerment, and I think the English word empowerment has a problem sometimes because of who is empowering you. That's something we always have to be aware of that. But in any case, the idea is you are the ones who decide. And I think that's, for me, this is crucial in what Emmanuel presented in the case of the Caledonian situation, but also that applies to us, Europeans, in the sense that how we can support the self-decision of all kinds of human beings in all parts of the world in order to develop the values that allows them to decide the kind of life they want. When the foreign forces and powers tries to get the lithium or tries to get other resources, and they use sometimes beautiful words in order to get that. So what is our position? Because we are in a way quite weak. The cultural sector is quite weak if we compare with other human activities. But at the same time, we are quite powerful. And I'm coming back to this idea that Emmanuel said, no? the two faces of the power of culture. So, but my question to Emmanuel at this very moment is how European culture operators must manage our own contradictions in order to allow everyone to develop their own values in order to decide which kind of life they want in a world that there is a lot of misuse of words. So what we see is that China and Russia use colonial or decolonial arguments to impose their colonial interests. So in which way? Because sometimes we feel we are the weakest because we are a little bit more fair than them. A little bit more, not many more.
Difficult question. I agree on the context that there is a deconnection, an absolute deconnection between international cultural commodification and kind of crispation. I don't know if crispation exists. No, crispation. Restriction, angry restriction on national populism on the other side. And there is a problem because on one side there is a successful development of business, and on the other side the political legitimacy. There is no political legitimacy which can regulate the international business, and at national level we are limited to more and more weak sovereignty, because the question of sovereignty is each day more not pertinent to deal with our cultural, environmental, social problems of equality, of sustainability, and so on. So, saying that, my answer would be that perhaps, and following a stronger peripheries project, which is very oriented toward this aspect, I would use the paradox of the strengths of the weak links. That is, in this context, on the one hand, we have national legitimacies that are more and more captured by populisms, and if we can see the general map of election in the world, I assume, I don't want to show you quantitative data, but you will assess that populism is generally very strong at national level and weaker at local level. And it is an opportunity to develop coalitions based on territorial levels. Because at territorial level, you have this capacity, this intersectional capacity, this intersectoral capacities to define culture in diverse ways that allow culture to be a cooperative instrument and not a confrontation instrument. So I think that it is an opportunity. My disagreement with Pedro, or my nuance with Pedro's discourse, that is precisely that periphery does not is not it is not a good way to give the periphery the orientation towards the center. So to be the center, the mission of the peripheries is to discuss, to criticize, to instrumentalize, to colonize the center without being colonialist. So naturally now for international and multicultural exchanges, we need to be close to the centers because they have veto power in that sense. But there is a very huge opportunity to base on peripheries, on territorial powers, on territorial actors to define or to influence the artistic and the cultural agenda in other ways. So not imitating the excellence criteria of national elites, for instance.
Well, now is your moment. We will divide the group in 3 rooms, and you have to discuss the following thing. In 10 days, we have elections at the Parliament of the European Parliament. Extreme right and the Conservatives, this is an hypothesis, I hope what happens, will win enough seats to impose a different kind of policies in the cooperation. So the topics proposed for Creative Europe and other projects will be changed, trying to follow their own agenda. And the question is, which kind of a strategy we need to develop from the local and territorial approach, like Emmanuel is proposing, in alliance with the people from other parts of the world in order to use the critical capacity of culture to resist, or maybe the word is not resist, is, now I will be a little bit ambitious, to impose other ways of connecting human beings through emotions and symbolic values. So this is what you have to discuss in smaller groups. We will be one group here, another group in the foyer, and the third group upstairs. So, but of course now Federico wants to say a last word. Okay.
No, I only want to say that I'm leaving with the team of the FDA this book on South American cultural management for double-clicking all that issues I couldn't devote time to. So it's available at the library of the university for you all.
So thank you very much, both of you. And the dialogue continues in the different rooms.
Thank you all. Luis, you are staying in this one, in the main room, and we suggest you invite people to come maybe to the first row so that it's not...
The people who will be in this room, please go to